Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. My name is Kathleen Hunt, and I'm a community manager here on the scholarships team at Udacity. And today I am joined by Mike Salem, lead technical.
Senior Learning Technologist.
Thank you, sorry, Senior Learning Technologist. I knew I was going to mess that up.
That's okay.
Here at Udacity. Mike is going to be talking more today about how you can build your portfolios, regardless of whether you are starting out in the tech field and making a career pivot, or if you've been in the field for several years already. So we have some prepared questions that you all submitted ahead of time, so thank you everyone who did fill out our questionnaire. And we'll also be taking some live questions from you today, so please post those in the chat, and we'll leave some time at the end to make sure that we're getting through as many of those as possible. So before we dive into your questions, I just want to talk to you a little bit, Mike, about your experience. I'd love to hear about how you ended up at Udacity and just maybe an overview of your career trajectory.
So it's a long and windy road. So there's a lot of different things that I've done. So my background actually is in mathematics. So I studied supply chain and production systems with my advisor in grad school, did stochastic simulation. I always knew I wanted to transition into the industry after grad school, but I didn't quite know where I was going to end up. Ideally, I wanted to go work for a company that was doing semiconductors like Intel or AMD and their processes for how they rebuild their chips and kind of optimizing that supply chain and that flow. Turns out that whenever when you go to school, most people don't end up doing the thing that they want to do. So when I actually came out, I was looking for a job just pretty much anywhere. I was pretty open. I knew I wanted to be in the industry, didn't know exactly which sector. I got in contact with a company that actually did ground control stations for UAVs, so it was more the robotics space. And I had applied for a position that was a software engineer. Now, I went into this interview, and I vividly recall, actually, they were asking me questions like, have you ever done computational geometry, artificial intelligence? And I was like, well, no, I'm a math major. And they're like, well, have you ever done any coding? And I was like, yeah, I've done a little bit like MATLAB or whatever. Like, have you ever coded in C++? And I said, no. And they said, oh, well, we primarily code in C++ here. And I said, okay. So I vividly recall actually like walking out of that interview and saying to myself, if I want to go work in the industry, then I need to learn how to code. And it looks like that in order to code, I need to go learn C++. I got in my car right from that interview, drove to a bookstore, bought a book on C++, and for 3 weeks I just put my head down and learned C++. Oh. Then I got the call back and I actually came and started to work there. So I came in, basically knowing how to write Hello World in C++, and I get thrown into this huge code base with all these different things, and I'm starting to interface with hardware, which is something I've never touched before in my life. So now I have GPS pucks, and I have, modems that I'm working with, and cameras, and all these different things, and I'm like, this is super weird. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? So I'm kind of getting my footing. I'm around really good, knowledgeable people. The company was roughly around at the time around 20 people or so, kind of small, really invested in their employees. So it gave me a good opportunity to kind of learn and grow and kind of work with more senior folks. While I was there, actually, there were some classes that were taught online from Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig, ironically enough, on artificial intelligence. So I decided I was going to take that with a couple of coworkers, started doing the class, and realized a lot of the techniques that are used in artificial intelligence are very similar to the same techniques that you use in mathematics. So there's constraint optimization, there's probability, there's all these different things. So maybe get a good firm grasp of kind of that sector and that field a little bit more. And I kind of wanted to learn more about that. I'm in the software space, I'm in the AI space, kind of been kind of interesting to me. Sebastian had then launched 2 Udacity free classes, his self-driving car, his iconic class, and then his web crawling class with David Evans, which was more Python based and stuff like that. That was my first exposure to Python. Really kind of enjoyed it, really kind of enjoyed the ground control, vehicles and those types of things. And I said, okay, well, if I really want to kind of go and pursue my career, for me personally, I felt like maybe Silicon Valley is the place to go. So I got in contact with a small startup, went and worked there for about a year. I was doing some Python work, I was doing some web crawling. I got exposure to some other different types of technologies while I was there. And it was really kind of good because it started to kind of solidify that this is kind of the area I wanted to be in. Now, when I was in grad school, studying supply chain and production systems, mathematics, and those types of things, I always had this dream of kind of going and working in finance. The allure of it. Arizona is where I grew up. We don't have a whole lot of finance there for that kind of quant style work. Got in contact with a company called Thomson Reuters. They're a Fortune 500 company, over 100,000 employees. I went and interviewed there and worked there on a research team with about 30 people. I did a lot of various tasks. A lot of it was data driven. Doing more data analysis. I actually worked as a data analyst while I was there. I did some data science work. I did some DevOps work. And I really kind of started to take take realm and shape in terms of this computer science kind of area. And as I was going through that, at night what I was actually doing was I was enrolled in our Georgia Tech program. And I started doing a second master's in computer science with emphasis in computational perception and robotics. And I really kind of started to enjoy more of the programming, the puzzles, the problem solving. And then that's kind of where my career started kind of going. Fast forward till now, I'm at Udacity. I've been here for almost 2 years. I started off on the artificial intelligence program as a student experience lead, which meant working with students and kind of helping troubleshoot their environments, work on rubrics, did something similar with robotics. Then I moved into more of a managerial type role where I currently work with, I used to be 8, but now there's 4 folks that are more of the technical side who are doing content fixes and updates inside of the classroom for the robotics, the self-driving car, and the flying car programs. So my career has kind of went through a bunch of different zigs and zags, but I think the main thread to kind of consider throughout this is I have that technical background. I come from mathematics. Mathematics is more of a core for a lot of different things. And because of that, I've kind of continued that thread of saying, as long as I'm doing something technical in this realm that involves data or problem solving and logic, it kind of fits into that wheelhouse.
That's really interesting to hear, because I think from my perspective as someone who doesn't work in a technical role per se, those things all sound really unrelated to me, but I think the way that you've been able to string them together is really cool and is probably really applicable to a lot of the folks who are joining today. So I'd love to hear what were the most successful tactics that you used to kind of advocate for your experience and your expertise when you were switching from one role to another? How did you make the case for yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And it's definitely a challenge because a lot of times, like for instance, finance was something I was really interested in pursuing. When I was in school, I didn't take a lot of finance classes. I took a lot of modeling classes in terms of mathematical modeling. And when you do stuff like that, it kind of relates tangentially, but then more or less directly as you kind of build upon it. But having the finance background and the finance domain knowledge, I didn't really have. So it's a lot of it is a lot of self-study, actually. It's a lot of like long nights of kind of coming home and saying to yourself, this is an area that I'm interested in pursuing. This is something I want to work on. This is a place that I want to go and try and make a career in. I need to invest time, effort, and energy. And I think part of that too is you have to be true to yourself about that. You have to have realistic expectations. For me, I knew that coming from the background that I had, doing something in finance meant that I was at a deficit in finance. And I knew that I was going to have a harder time catching up in finance than somebody who actually came in with that background. So you have to be true and you have to understand that there are going to be some sort of brief learning curves or limitations that you're going to encounter, but you have to kind of push through those and kind of really devote and dedicate yourself to doing so in order to kind of be successful in that area.
And how are you able to develop your application materials, like your resume, your cover letter, and your portfolio, since that's the theme of today, to back up what you were doing outside of the application process?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 ways that I've been able to do it kind of successfully. One is I've never said no to a new project while I'm at work. And a lot of times you'll end up working on something and you'll find out that that experience is relevant for something totally unrelated later on. I've seen that time and time again in my career where I've worked on a project that I'm like, I don't know where I'm ever going to use this. And then 2 or 3 years later, I'd see something and be like, well, this is actually very much like this.
Yeah.
So I'm actually able to kind of go back and draw upon that and kind of work on it. So I think by not limiting yourself to a certain type of domain, when a problem comes across your desk, I think it kind of helps broaden that ability to kind of diversify your portfolio. With that said, though, it becomes a little bit more challenging sometimes when you go to an interview because a lot of folks will ask you questions that are very, very in-depth, and they're expecting you to be, an expert in machine learning or an expert in AI or an expert in web development or whatever the case may be, and you might just have bits and pieces here and there. So I think really trying to get that broad exposure and then trying to dig into it more so if it's something that you're really interested in. What I would do personally is I would actually come home at night and I would actually try to find something similar to work on or something that kind of piques my interest a little bit, and I would try to kind of develop that on my own. It might be something that's been out there already that somebody else has done, and it might be just me trying to recreate and understand. It might be something brand new that I'm working on that no one else has done. And I think both sides of that are fine. I think the ability to kind of take a project that somebody else has worked on and kind of put that into your portfolio as something that you've kind of been able to recreate with the caption of saying that you've recreated this and this isn't brand new or original work, but you did go through it and you can understand the pain points and some of the limitations and some of the problems, I think is really good. And I think there's also something to be said about a blue ocean type of problems, what I kind of refer to it as, where nobody's done it. So there's no right or wrong, and you have the ability to be creative and just kind of gather your experience and figure out what you like about it, what you don't like about it, and is this something that you're interested in pursuing?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like you kind of combined previous projects that you worked on in a professional setting with projects that you adapted from things that were out in the world already that you kind of took a new take on, and then also some totally innovative, creative projects that you started on your own and melded those together to create your portfolio.
Yes, and I would say that primarily it starts off with, in my experience, coming more from what I've done at work, then into more of the recreation, and then more into the creative free response zone.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to kind of jump right into that free response zone right away, and a little bit is because you don't have any bearings for where you're going, what you're trying to achieve, how you want to achieve it.
That makes sense. My last question for you before I said I want to leave plenty of time to go over the questions that students submitted. What would you say was the most challenging part just of your overall career path, and what has been the most surprising thing that you've experienced?
So that's a great question. I think one of the most challenging things is that constant learning curve and having to be prepared. I've been, a constant learner, either taking classes either academically or just self-study since I've graduated about 10 years ago, just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of how long this has been going on for me. And I think that's one of the things that's bode well for me kind of going forward in my career, because it's the ability to constantly learn new things and kind of continue to work on things. And I think in the tech industry, things move very quickly. So even if you're kind of out of it for a few months, you'll start seeing things pass you by. So it's really important to kind of stay on it. I think that's something that's worked out relatively well for me. I think some of the challenges that I've faced are really, I'm competing against people when I went for data analyst positions or things like that. I'm competing against people who have very specific domain knowledge, who are very intimate with an area already, and I don't have that kind of skill set yet, right? I'll gather that while I'm on the job, and I'll gather that through some self-study, but you don't have that same sort of intimacy or familiarity with the topic. And I think the ability to constantly just continue to push yourself forward and not get discouraged is probably the best approach that seems to have worked well for me.
Awesome. Great. Well, I have some questions that you all submitted, and I'd love to ask you some of those right now. So the first question that I have, and I think that you kind of started to address this in some of what you previously said, but would love for you to expand on what is your advice for building your portfolio to suit multiple roles and skill sets?
Yeah, that's a tricky problem, and it's a challenging one, and it's really interesting. I think the best approach for something like that is to really try to find a common thread and just kind of say, this is where my main area is, and then I'm going to kind of branch out along that and say, okay, so for instance, for me, as an example, my math background. So I know the algorithm, the modeling, the data side of things is kind of where I feel strongest. And then it's just adding kind of like ancillary pieces to that, right? So I'm adding computer science to that. I'm adding machine learning. I'm adding computer vision, right? I'm adding all these different little areas here and there, but I'm kind of saying, but this is kind of where my core strength is. And so even if I'm branching into finance now and doing something in there, I always have this anchor. And I ended up having a conversation with somebody a while back, and their background was actually in swarms and swarm robotics. And we were having a conversation around the idea of, well, how did you get involved in medicine, for an example? And what she had said to me was, first thing she did was go get the largest book she could possibly find on cancer and just read it cover to cover. And what she said about that was, I didn't understand a large chunk of anything. It was in there, but at least it gave me some sort of idea. And I knew I was always rooted with swarm theory, swarm information, swarm optimization, et cetera. So that was my anchor when I always went out into that new field to kind of go and apply. So I think building your portfolio to appeal to multiple jobs, make sure you have that common thread inside of your portfolio. Make sure you have that common delineage across all of these different domains, so that you can always tell somebody that's where my particular emphasis is. And these are all the other things I can do based off of where I feel that I'm really strong.
Great. I actually have a follow-up question to that. This isn't a student question, but would you recommend having multiple portfolios, or do you really recommend just having one with that common thread that unites everything? Or if people's experience is really diverse and it's hard to connect them, do you think it's a good idea to have different types of portfolios for different types of fields?
So I think generally the idea of having different portfolios for different fields is typically a good approach. It shows that you're kind of consistent and dedicated to an area, which I think employers particularly like. I think that's a really good argument in your favor when you're going in for a job interview to kind of say like, this, I'm interested in pursuing data. So here's all of these data related things that I've done. Or I'm interested in doing web development. So here's all the web development projects I've done. And then it kind of shows that. And then you can go into one of those interviews and you can also discuss, oh, I do have some background over here in data or web development or natural language processing or whatever the case may be. And it kind of shows that you have a little bit more well-rounded skill set. And it also shows that you're willing to kind of grow and take on new challenges as well, outside of just your particular area of expertise.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Next question is, should my portfolio include personal software projects or only the projects that I've freelanced or have been paid to do?
So I think it should be a mix of both. I think you want to definitely highlight some of the things that you've done for an employer or a contractor, I guess, or as freelance work. I think those are things that are really good as long as you have the permission to kind of be able to show that off. I definitely think you could show it. If you can't show it off, perhaps you could be able to talk about it, and you might just have to leave out some of the specifics, depending on the requirements of the contract that you've had. I think also having personal pet projects is a really good way to kind of allow you to explore your interest, but also show an employer kind of some of your areas that you're passionate about that might be a little bit outside of your realm as well. So, as an example, doing something in web development, you might really enjoy web, but you might also have a passion for dogs or something like that. So you might have built your own little Facebook for dogs type of application or something like that just for you, but it allows your employer or your potential employer to kind of know like, oh, I have background doing this, I worked on this pet project for me, I actually enjoy working on this stuff on my own part-time, and I'm willing to try new things, and I think that's kind of a good thing. So you want to mix between both.
Okay, great. Next question is, when building your portfolio, should one include all of the skills and achievements that one has made or only those that are relevant to the current field?
So this is a really good question, and a lot of people take different approaches. Some people prefer to use just a single resume or a single portfolio to kind of showcase everything. Other people tend to build more honed portfolios. I think it really depends on kind of what you want to achieve as an individual. My recommendation would most likely be that you split those up based on the particular area or sector that you're interested in, because it shows a little bit more of a stronger case. If you're a little light in that sector, then you might want to include some other things just to kind of show that you're a constant learner and developer, and you're really interested in kind of self-learning and personal benefit, like, not personal benefit, but self-improvement.
Great. The next question is, I've worked in several industries and am looking to move to another. How do I make my resume and portfolio attractive for the next industry I'm moving into?
Yes, this is a great question. And this is something that I kind of had an issue with when I was looking to kind of move to finance. And one of the things I started doing was I just started reading books on finance. I started reading books on, quantitative modeling, stock markets, et cetera, and just trying to gather as much information and knowledge about the area as I can. So at least if I went to an interview, I feel like I could talk intelligently about it, even if I might not have a whole lot of experience just yet. As you have more time and as you're kind of ramping up your job search, just do some small, really quick, few hour pet projects or something like that, just to kind of be able to talk about something and kind of show that you have interest in that area. And if you have a really big goal in mind, maybe start working towards that. It doesn't have to be finished in a week. It doesn't have to be finished in a month. I mean, even if you're talking about it during an interview, you can say, well, I'm kind of working on this. I'm not all the way through this yet. Here's where I am. Here's some of the problems that I faced. Here's how I solved some of those problems. And I think it shows people that you have dedication to the space. And you have dedication to that kind of career path. And I think it's a really good sign for an employer to say, this is somebody who's really committed to making this career transition. And this isn't some sort of like medium stop in terms of going from this to another job.
Yeah. I think there's, I'm hearing you say a lot about iteration and just constantly building and constantly learning. And what I'm getting from a lot of your advice is that this is very much an iterative process.
Yes.
And it sounds like your application materials, there's no final one end goal. It's constantly being built and you're constantly growing, building your skills, updating your materials to reflect that. And that's okay. Would you say that it's probably a good idea to be really open to the idea of having something that isn't 100% finished and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good?
Oh, absolutely. So there's I've had this conversation with several people in the past, and as a mathematician, you tend to not want to work on problems until you fully understand the problem that you're working on. And this was something that was very hard for me early in my career when I was dealing with a large code base, because I was like, I'm making a modification, but I don't know what the entire system does. And talking to some more of the more senior folks that were around, they used to tell me, it doesn't really matter if you understand the entire system, you just need to understand this part. Make an improvement on this part, and then you can go back and you can go and learn more as you need to go. And that's been really beneficial for me. It's helped me get over a lot of the hurdles of saying, of this feeling of being overwhelmed, where you kind of start something off and you're like, I want to go work in this sector. Robotics is a great example for me, where it's like, I want to go do more in here, but I don't know where to start. And there's you know, a plethora of information, and there's all these different avenues and concentrations and specializations, and I don't really know where I want to be. Just pick something, try it out, try it small. You know, if you find like that's really interesting, then maybe pursue that a little bit more. If it's not really interesting, maybe try something else in a different specialization inside of that topic. And that iterative process is really important, and I think the idea to being open to criticism is okay. And I think that's something that else a lot of people have a really hard time with, is kind of hearing the negative. Everybody wants to build something and be told that it's great, it's wonderful, but when you get that positive, that crucial feedback, that's the feedback that actually helps you get better. Hearing that you're great and wonderful doesn't really give you that same sense of improvement, and doesn't allow you to get better. All it does is allow you to kind of stroke your ego and feel really good about what you've done. But definitely feel free to put yourself out there, try something a little different, and kind of iterate upon it, because that's how you achieve greatness, in my opinion.
It's great to hear you say that about feedback. I used to work for a workforce development nonprofit, and we used to say all the time that all feedback is good feedback. There's no such thing as bad feedback, so I totally agree with you on that.
I'm glad.
Wonderful. So the next question is, how can you use your portfolio to highlight your nano degree, and how can you use that to really make your portfolio look different and stand out from others?
So this is a great question, and this is something I actually tell our robotics students quite a bit, because I used to work on that program for quite a while, very directly with students. I think one of the things is, if you're looking to transition fields, the first thing that should go up top should be your new projects, right? Projects related in that field above your work experience, because you want to show this is the area that you're looking to move into, and this is the area that you're interested in pursuing. Secondly, when it comes to your nano degree program and the projects there, I think putting your nano degree is a great first step, right? A lot of folks don't have that on their resume. It's going to be able to show some really interesting and really good creative projects. The problem that you run into now is, let's suppose you and I both have the same nano degree, we both apply to the same job. How do I stand out differently from you? And one of the ways you do that is, while the project itself is intended to give you a starting point, it's not intended to be the end point. There's always much more work you can do. There's always ways that you can tweak any of your projects to make them your own personal project. So whether it's just taking the exact same project and applying it to a different domain, or it's just continuing upon it or adding a new feature, those are ways that you're going to be able to stand out from other people. And I also think something really important that people don't typically do is actually write down what they're doing. Put a blog post together explaining the process and explaining some of the pain points that you went through, explaining some of the things that you tried that didn't work out well, explaining what you did that did work well. Because the problem is, when you go back and look at code, and I have this problem all the time, is you don't really remember exactly what you did right away unless you have some good comments and good documentation. So that blog post allows you to provide that, and it also provides a good talking point for when you're talking to an employer. Because now your thoughts are down and you can actually explain your code, you can explain your projects in a very cohesive way. And it allows you to kind of show your skills and highlight your skills in a much better format, as well as your communication skills.
That's wonderful to hear, and I think it's also just good for your visibility. Like, having more presence online, especially in this day and age, is a good thing, and recruiters are looking at your LinkedIn and looking at all your materials, and if you can link to not only your GitHub but also a blog that you've written about the projects that you're doing, I think that's a really great way to highlight.
Yeah, definitely.
Yourself.
Definitely don't be shy in self-promotion. I think self-promotion is a big piece of where things are moving. 10 years ago versus now, I mean, it was a very different landscape. The world is becoming much more global in terms of competition and industry. And because of that, you have to do different things to kind of make yourself stand out. So definitely don't be afraid to be your own champion.
Absolutely. So the next question, pre-submitted question, is In the case where my aim is to become a freelancer and compete on a global level, speaking of a global economy, what advice would you have to ensure that my portfolio is relevant and interesting to would-be clients?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is you want to do some market research and you want to identify what kind of clients you want to work with. So if you're looking for clients that are interested in web development, you should probably tailor your projects towards web development as opposed to data science. So really finding the core of the people that you're trying to work with in the sector, finding particular clients, specific clients in general, seeing what their competitors in the space are doing for those clients, and trying to see how you diversify or stand out from those types of competitors. I think that's a really important way to really make sure that your portfolio can really stand out and you can bring something unique to the table. Also, don't be afraid to look at some more of the business side of things too. Maybe it's pricing, maybe it's staff, maybe it's quality of work. Look at all of these different things in terms of your competitors and try to make the pitch. Definitely have something prepared too as a freelancer. You want to walk into a meeting and have a pitch ready to go, where you can actually give them that elevator pitch right away and say, here's the general idea of what I'm doing, here's who I am, here's why I'm better than your competitors, and here's what I can provide, as opposed to kind of going into this meeting a little bit less prepared and feeling like it's much more, you're not in control of the situation in terms of what you want to accomplish.
Absolutely. So the last question, pre-submitted before we jump over to live questions, is, as a beginner on the data science path, what should I start doing that will contribute to my data science portfolio?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things you can do. Data science is a huge field, and I would not personally consider myself an expert in data science, even though I've done it for a while and even though I have a math background, because there's always so much to learn. So I think the first thing is kind of figure out what you want to do in data science, then try to pick a sector maybe. So maybe you're really interested in healthcare, or maybe you're really interested in retail, or maybe you're interested in real estate, and try to pick try to get a general feel of what's going on in there, what are some of the techniques and methods that are used, and just start reading. You can learn a lot just by seeing what other people have done, but don't stop there. That's a very good starting place. The next thing you have to do is you have to recreate. So Yogi Berra has a wonderful quote, and I absolutely love this quote. And he says, in theory, practice and theory are the same. In practice, they're different, right? Because there's this notion that if you look at something that you think you understand it, but you don't really understand it until you do it. So then start picking small little projects, start playing around with different things. One of the things I think is really useful in data science is to build yourself a code base and build yourself a bunch of snippets of code that you're typically going to run or problems that you're typically going to see. That way you don't reinvent the wheel or have to go look it up each time. You have your own code and you know exactly how you like to do it, and then you can kind of draw upon that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We have some live questions coming in right now. So if you have questions that Mike has not already touched upon, please feel free to continue adding those to the chat. And like I said, we'll get through as many of them as we can. But the first live question that was submitted is, should our portfolio show all of our work, the best examples, or a variety?
So I definitely think show your best work first, right? If I'm looking at somebody's resume or portfolio, because I've been on both sides. I've worked several jobs, so I've been the interviewee several times, and I've been the interviewer several times. So I definitely think being able to showcase your best work first definitely kind of sets the bar. So I kind of know what I'm looking at. Additionally, most employers might not go through all of your projects. So if your best projects are kind of grounded all the way buried at the bottom, then really they're going to see some of your work that you really don't feel that good about, and it doesn't really maybe showcase or highlight your skills. So I definitely think put your best work up front. If you're a little light in your portfolio, meaning you don't have a lot of projects, then maybe you want to talk about some of the other projects, but also give some sort of explanation around those too. This is maybe don't classify it as it's not my best work, but maybe say this is a work in progress, or maybe I'm constantly refining this. Say something that kind of really shows that you're still dedicated and interested in pursuing this, even if it's something that might not be at the forefront. Maybe it's on the back burner for right now, but it kind of shows that you want to go back and improve this and you understand that there's limitations. So I definitely think put your best stuff first and then kind of work down in terms of quality, but don't be afraid to kind of explain why you feel that quality isn't as good as some of your better work.
Excellent. I mean, I think it's exactly the same as what you said about the resumes. You want your most relevant and most recent projects at the top of your resume because you want those to be the first things that people see when they look at your materials.
And generally as an interviewer or, hiring manager or some of these things, resumes, they're all over the place, to be fair. And a lot of folks can actually read a resume in about 10 to 20 seconds and make a decision. So if your experience isn't relevant from the get-go and it's kind of buried inside of your resume, they might not have a lot of time to read that. And that might just be because you might have thousands of resumes that you're trying to review in a day, or you might have, just 2 or 3 resumes. So it also depends on the person who's kind of reviewing these resumes. So you might get somebody who's very, very thorough, who wants to read through it all. You might get somebody who just wants a quick glance and is looking for very specific things. So the other thing is don't take any of the process personal. I think that's a really big thing to kind of tell people, especially if you're going to transition into a new career, into a new field. Like, none of this feedback, if you get declined a job position, or you accept a job position, whatever the case may be, like, it's not personal. Like, nobody's going behind closed doors and talking about you and saying how bad your resume looks or something like that. So typically people are pretty amicable. They just want to find somebody that's going to work well with them, and there's a variety of reasons that you might also get passed up. So try to keep a positive attitude through the process, and just try to get better each and every time you have an interview.
Yeah. I think that's a really great thing to remind people to kind of keep in mind, especially because the job search process can feel demoralizing and can be really tough sometimes. So I definitely agree with keeping that in mind throughout the entire process.
Yeah, definitely. And there was an entrepreneur, I believe she's maybe in her late 20s, early 30s, and she was rejected over 100 times for her idea from VCs. Now she runs a $100 million company.
There you go.
So, I mean, all you need is the one yes in some cases, right? So don't be afraid, and don't feel like just because somebody said no one time, it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means it's not for them, or they're not seeing what you have inside.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is, how can I best describe each project in my portfolio? Should I focus on the technologies used, challenges faced, results, etc.?
Yeah, so I think a great approach is actually to provide a summary. So I wouldn't go super in depth from the beginning, like a project view. So I would show some sort of screenshot if it's a web project or some sort of code project, or the code in action or doing something. If it's more data related, then I think it's more of a blog post. But you want to set it up, you want to tell the story. So you should always start off with, here's the reason why I'm doing this problem, here's how I went about kind of tackling this problem, here are the results from that, here's what I can do to make it better. Never end at just, I tackled the problem, let's move on, because there's always improvement. But I think providing some sort of high level, I think, is a really good approach, and it kind of lets an employer know right away, like, oh, there's enough here for me to kind of dig in and drill into this now that it's caught my eye, and then have something a little bit more thorough maybe underneath.
Okay. This question has come up, I think, a couple times. For folks who are really new to the development field or the data field or any technical field, what are kind of the key components that every portfolio needs to include?
So, again, I think when it comes to the technical, if you're trying to move into a technical field from more of a soft skill or non-technical field, there's a lot of challenges with that. And one of the big things, the big question mark typically is, can you do the technical work? So I definitely think showcasing some of that technical work is probably going to be the biggest highlight inside of your portfolio. Don't talk just about the social problem that you're trying to solve, or things from a very high level. Like, don't be afraid to get into your nitty-gritty with some of your portfolios on at least one project. And make sure you have this one project that you can use as a talking point when you're doing an interview too. I think that's very important. Like, you want to be able to really dive down deep into that and explain to an employer, like, yes, I know what I'm talking about technically, and I did all of this work, and I can explain it to you. And I can go and learn more because I have some other ideas for some areas to kind of improve upon. So I definitely think that's really important to kind of showcase and highlight.
Great. What advice do you have for somebody who is considering leaving their current line of work in tech for something different? I think from kind of a risk mitigation perspective.
So that they're looking to leave from tech to go
I think pivot to a different field within tech.
Within tech.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as I've mentioned a few times, when you're transitioning from one field to another, even inside of the same sector, let's say tech is the sector, you run into some learning curves. You run into some issues with do you have as much domain knowledge or expertise as some of the people that you're going to be competing against? But I think the best way to go about that is really just kind of realize that there is going to be a learning curve, realize that it is going to take a little bit of time, nothing is instantaneous, really build upon it, really talk to other folks inside of that field, get a good perspective. Find people from the industry who've worked in it, ask them what they like about it, what they don't like about it, research other companies inside of that space, figure out what they're solving, see if their mission aligns with what you're interested in pursuing, see if the technologies are interesting to you or the problems that are being faced. If they're not, then it's probably not the right pivot for you. If they are, then I definitely consider like doing more in that space, right? So maybe it's starting to put together some sort of pet project now that you've done a little bit of that, or talking to people who have pet projects, or playing around with somebody else's work and just getting a feel for it, and just kind of build slow. Like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be done overnight, and a lot of this process is long. Nobody likes the job hunt process, right? It's usually terrible. Like most people will say that. Nobody says, I like to go to a bunch of interviews and be told no, and then have to come home and do this process all over again. So I think, just being patient and realizing that by providing the right skills and by finding the right match in terms of an employer, you're going to be very happy in the long run. And don't forget, that's the reason why you're going through this whole process.
Absolutely. That builds really well off of the theme last week, which was about the job search process. And we talked a lot about networking and shared some great resources and email templates and things like that to help people reach out. So hopefully folks can use those tools and resources to put your advice into action about finding people in the field to speak to.
That's great.
Yeah. What is the best way to present a portfolio? Would you say on a website, on GitHub? You mentioned that doing more of a blog format for data roles might be a good way to present your work. What are the different formats, and what would you recommend using each one for?
Yeah, so I think a website's a really good way to kind of showcase your work. You're in control a lot of times with the website, especially if you're going to build your website. So it's a really good thing to tell somebody too. Like, oh, this is not only my website, but I didn't use a template. I actually built this website. So I think that's a really interesting and cool thing. I don't have much experience with the website of things, so that's something that's usually out of the question for me personally. I think GitHubs are good. I think GitHubs, you can put together a lot of information. Some of the issues I see with things like GitHub, though, are sometimes it's public, unless you want to pay for a private repository. In that case, I prefer Bitbucket, because then I can actually work on a pet project that I don't want to share with somebody. And if an employer is really interested, I can send them a link directly, as opposed to having somebody else kind of go and take whatever I'm working on and kind of claim it as theirs. When it comes to what I feel's best, I think anything, honestly, is good, right? Like, there's no such thing as bad self-promotion, in my opinion, right? If people are talking about you and you're getting your name out there and people are aware of what you're doing in the space, then you're doing something right. I think that's better than having no presence whatsoever and having people go, I don't know who this person is. I can't find them on LinkedIn. I can't find any of their projects that they've done. Because a lot of times that does play a role when an employer kind of goes to interview you. So a lot of times you'll see people get friend requests for LinkedIn or something like that, where a recruiter is trying to look them over really quickly to see do they have the skills and the expertise that they're referring to.
Gotcha. Great. For somebody who is only interested in remote opportunities and doesn't have the option of relocating, how can they work around this restriction in order to increase their chances of getting a job? And just by the context of the question, I'm guessing this person probably maybe doesn't have a ton of career opportunities in their local area.
Sure. So I don't have much experience with this personally. I've worked on site with every company that I've worked for. One of the things that I can say from folks that I have worked with who have been more remote is, number one, don't be afraid to kind of broaden your scope and look for other opportunities. Like, you might be very, very interested in, let's say, data that's related to real estate. But that might not be something that's around your area, but somebody might have something in more of the marketing space, data in the marketing space. Don't be afraid to try something different. I actually had a friend of mine at my last company, and he said something, and we were working on a project that wasn't particularly very interesting to me at first, and until he started digging into it, and he started asking some really, really interesting questions. And he said to me, every problem that you're working on can be interesting. It just depends on how far you dig. So don't limit yourself right away if you feel that you're remote and you don't have a lot of opportunities. Try to see what those opportunities are and what they bring, and then try to find interesting problems and creative problems in that space. And I think you'll find out that you'll be still very satisfied.
Great. Is there a good way to highlight your soft skills in your portfolio, and how would you recommend the best way of doing that?
Yes, so I think the easiest way to highlight your soft skills is by making sure that your writing is well done. So definitely making sure that there's no punctuation mistakes, no grammar mistakes. Make sure that your resume is written in more of the active tense, right? So presented, demonstrated, show all of those things. And a lot of times when you're talking to a company, one of the ways they typically operate is they usually have a recruiter or an HR person reach out to you first for the first phone screen for an introductory. And what they're doing there is they're testing your soft skills as well. How well do you communicate? How well can you convey information? So you get two opportunities, I think, in my opinion. One is first by making sure your resume is well written and clean and organized. And then the other way is by actually having a conversation with somebody, either on the phone or face to face, and allowing them to see your soft skills.
Great. I'm going to put a plug in right now for the resume webinar that I'm going to be doing tomorrow, because we're going to be talking a lot about how to proofread your resume, which can certainly be applied to cover letters, your LinkedIn, your website, any other place where you have a written online presence. So I would agree that that tends to be a very common error that people make. So definitely tune in for that. All that I have are Udacity projects to showcase. Is that enough?
Yes. Yes. I mean, you have Udacity projects while somebody else has none, right? So that right there allows you to kind of stand out from somebody else. Now, just because you feel like all you have is Udacity projects, that's not true. You can actually take all of those projects, go and modify them, and make them into something else and make them your own. Now you have also original projects that nobody else has, right? So you can always build upon things. I think the big thing to remember is always be creative. Don't be afraid to experiment and try. The tech field is based on that. And tech field doesn't necessarily have some of the same stigmas that some other fields have, where if you fail, you're kind of blackballed. In tech, it's more considered a learning experience. I know particularly in Silicon Valley, that's the way it works. You'll see a lot of folks who come from companies who are working at different companies right now who had their own company that failed. They're not labeled as failures, they're labeled as entrepreneurs and people who tried. And you won't know until you try. So definitely start off with your Udacity projects, showcase those, and then talk about what you're doing to improve them or make them better or do something different or unique. And don't be afraid, just have fun with it. No one's telling you what you can do with your own projects. They're your projects. And, just make sure you enjoy what you're doing, and that's going to help you find what you really like.
Excellent. Again, the theme of iterating on your work comes up again.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all iteration. The idea of cannon shots and these one-time hurrahs, they don't typically work, right? And they're very hard to gain momentum, and a lot of times people feel discouraged if they've done this. So I know from a finance background, right, this is kind of like the eggs in one basket for your portfolio. All you buy is one stock, right? And then the stock goes down and you're ruined. But if you're diversified, right, you have the ability to kind of carry and seek through. So your diversification in this case is iteration.
Absolutely. Is a portfolio required for every single job application?
I don't think it's required for every single job application. I think a resume in a lot of cases is usually good. I think what we talk about in terms of portfolio, like if we put this a little bit more broadly or loosely, what you're saying is I have a set of projects that I can talk about that I've worked on either as a hobbyist, as a professional, or in school, and really show that I have a deep understanding of the material that was being presented. So I think as long as you have your portfolio in some form, whether it's being able to express it verbally, whereas visually, I think that's okay in a lot of cases. I think having a visual aspect definitely helps with a lot of folks who are more visual. It also really kind of shows the ability to kind of see what you've done. And sometimes they're even interactive. It allows people to kind of play with it. So I think sometimes that can definitely sway a hiring manager or a recruiter or somebody to kind of talking to you and finding out more.
And when for jobs where you are submitting your portfolio or a project showcase, would you recommend, what's the best format to make sure that gets to the employer? Is it just a link in your resume? Is it in your cover letter, just on your LinkedIn? How do you make sure that that's visible?
My opinion is all channels of communication are good for that, right?
Okay.
So I would typically put my blog post or whatever I have on my resume and kind of showcase that and highlight that. You could probably put hyperlinks too, because a lot of your resumes are submitted now in PDF format. So allow somebody to actually click through and go see it as opposed to having to copy paste it. I think putting it in your LinkedIn is obviously a great thing as well. I think putting a note in your cover letter to kind of explain it again, like really make sure you're hammering home and showcasing like how you're different and what you've done that you feel really good about that you want to showcase. And I think that's going to lead to the person who's screening your resume or screening your portfolio or whatever to at least go and explore and kind of look into it a little bit more. And I think that's really what you're after here.
Great. If we modify our Udacity projects, going off of your advice from before, should we show where the original projects came from, or should people clone it and then start kind of a new project that branches off of that? Should it be clear? How much should people stick to the original versus branching off and doing something kind of totally new and separate?
Sure. So really this comes down to, it's up to you, right? It's up to how you like to work and how you want, what's your workflow, what's your style. Some people would probably prefer to take the original project and just continue to modify that into something else and work right off of that. Some people might say, well, I have my original project over here, I'm going to copy that over here, and I'm going to work in a new clean code base with this as my base. And I think both are okay. My personal method would be actually to take my old project, copy it over to a new location, and then work on it there, because now I know my old project in its current glory is going to stand and it's going to work well. And anything I do to the new project that might mess it up, I don't have to worry about kind of backtracking. Now, of course, you can always revert with your code base and do something like that as well. But you might want to be able to show them off as two separate things, and it depends on how much iteration that you're planning to do. So if you're building just a website and you're adding maybe another button or two, you might be able to work off the same project. But if you're going to build a whole new website and a whole new structure with all new templates, then maybe it's going to be something totally different. Then maybe you'd probably want to work somewhere else.
That all makes sense to me. Would you say it's important to document the process of building a project, or is the final project, the final result, more important?
I strongly advise documenting the entire project. So this is actually something that folks on my team right now are actually working on. So as we've moved over to kind of doing more updates in the classroom for the robotics type programs, one of the requirements I have for my folks as learning technologists is to actually write blog posts about some of the updates that they're making as they're making them, as they're going through this content and fixing and making things more refined or whatever the case may be, or expanding upon them. And what that does is it allows them to kind of identify some of the problems that they faced as they were going through the material. It allows them to put their thoughts down at that time. And then it also allows them to show that final product once it's done. And I think being able to kind of go back and looking at a project and say to yourself, oh, this was really hard at this point. I can talk about all those pain points here with an employer. That's a really good thing to kind of show. It kind of shows how you overcome the adversity, as opposed to just kind of saying, here's the final project and this is how great and wonderful it looks, but there's nothing I don't really remember much about how that process went because it was 4 months ago or 3 years ago or whatever the case may be.
Is it, as a older programmer, I once had a recruiter tell me, Android programming is for the young. How do I navigate ageism, or any other ism for that matter, in tech?
Yes. So there's a notorious stigma with aging developers, and it's well known inside of the industry. I think the best way to kind of combat that is be able to show that you can do that type of work. So if Android programming for this particular person was an issue, then I would show that Android projects that I've built, and I would show how good they are, and I would also look at what I've been able to do as somebody who comes with a lot of experience that maybe somebody else who is a little bit more junior starting out doesn't have. So I think it's really important to kind of tell the story from the perspective that makes you enticing to somebody and allows you to show what's unique about you. In this case, having years of experience is the thing that makes you unique. So you can talk about all of the pain points that come from that design process, that build process, the testing that you've learned throughout your career that maybe somebody more junior just hasn't encountered yet. It's a great question.
Yes, yeah, and it comes up pretty frequently,
Yes.
I think, for lots of folks. Once you have a job, how can you balance learning new things on the job while working?
Yeah, so this is hard, and this is something that I've done. When I was at Reuters, I was actually going home at night, and I would spend my entire nights and weekends working on the Georgia Tech program for my second master's in computer science. So I think the thing is, really, you don't have to go all in all the time. but you do have to make small incremental progress. And it's the same thing when it comes to learning a new language, whether it be a programming language or an actual just foreign language. The way you do it is by consistency. So making sure that you're going to kind of work on this, even if it's 50 minutes a day or 2 hours a day or whatever the case may be, half hour even, that you're constantly moving towards it and it kind of stays fresh in your mind. I think that's a better approach than trying to say, I have to go learn Hadoop, let's say, as an example. I'm going to spend all weekend learning Hadoop, and then I'm not going to touch it again for 3 months. You'd be much better off saying, okay, well, I'm going to do some of this configuration, and I'm going to learn how to spin up these machines, and I'm going to learn how to network them, and kind of build like these small like stop points, but that still feel like achievements, even if they're not major achievements, because that momentum keeps you excited, it keeps you wanting to come back and do more.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And I think this will be our last live question before we wrap up. Would you say that a traditional university degree is necessary for a career in tech?
So this is an interesting question, and I have a lot of friends who actually have come from non-university backgrounds, non-academic backgrounds. I have a good friend actually that ran a successful multi-million-dollar business, sold it off to a major company, who dropped out of college because they felt that the material that they were taking in college was all stuff that they had done by running their own business and building that while they were in high school. So I think tech is one of those fields that's a little bit more forgiving about having that traditional academic background, whereas medicine might be a little bit more challenging. I think you can definitely do it. I think one of the big things with tech is it's more about the idea of can you do the work and not necessarily your credentials. I think there was an article recently that said something like Google, Facebook, IBM are no longer interested in where you went to college or what you got your degree in. Mm-hmm. And I think there might be more of a focus that's starting to see on can you actually do the work as opposed to do you have an accreditation. And I think that could be a good thing. And I think that's something you should leverage in your favor if you're coming from that non-traditional background.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for answering all of these questions today. I have one last question just to wrap things up.
Sure.
And if there are, what are the top 1 to 3 pieces of advice that you really want people who are watching this session to come away with?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is definitely continue learning. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, that has to be the thing. You can't stop learning just because you finished school or just because you finished a nano degree program. What's next, right? There's always something more to learn. The second thing is be patient, right? Nothing is going to come to you instantaneously, especially if you're transitioning into a new field. It's a hard-fought road. Take your time, realize that you're getting better each day, and don't discourage. Don't be your own worst enemy. Third is have fun, right? I think a lot of times in this process, people lose track of that. You're learning, you're growing, you're getting better, and it's about a journey that you're looking to kind of achieve in your life. So make sure you're having fun on that journey. If not, it becomes just a job hunt. It becomes just building a portfolio. It becomes a chore as opposed to a passion. Mm-hmm. Don't let it turn into a chore.
Wonderful. This is all excellent advice. Thank you so much for your time today, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me, Kathleen.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. And thank you all for your wonderful questions today. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you again, Mike. This is the second week of Career Month. The theme this week is all about the job application process. Last week was about the job search. And I hope that everyone who joined today can join tomorrow morning my time, I should say. I'm going to be leading a webinar on updating your resume with your Udacity experience. And I'm also going to be live editing a couple resumes that you all submitted. So I hope that you all can join us, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.